Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Carpenter, the curator of Japanese art here at the Metropolitan. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this Sunday at the Met event. It accompanies the exhibition upstairs. I hope most of you have seen it, Brush Writing in the Arts of Japan. The exhibition will be up until January and early November. We'll be rotating some of the textiles and all of the Japanese prints and illustrated books. So I hope you'll come back to see the second rotation. The exhibition is made possible by the Miriam and Ira D. Wallach Foundation. This exhibition was a little bit of an experiment with a subject that I've been working on for many years, and I'm very pleased at the response it's gotten from the public. And today's program is just a way to give you a new way of looking at some of the aspects of the exhibition. At the end of the lectures, we'll have an actual demonstration of Zen calligraphy by Shōdō Harada Rōshi, who has come all the way from Japan to join us. And we are going to begin the program with a lecture by Tomoko Sakomura, who is an associate professor of art history at Swarthmore College. Tomoko received her BA from Keio University in Tokyo. She did her MA and PhD here in New York at Columbia University. And she has done extensive work on the subject that she's speaking on today and many of the works in the exhibition. And she's at work on a book tentatively titled Poetry as Image: The Visual Culture of Waka Poetry in Late Medieval Japan. Please join me in welcoming Tomoko Sakomura.
Thank you, Dr. Carpenter. It was in the very galleries upstairs where I first discovered the arts of Japan many years ago, and it is truly an honor to have been invited to speak at this event in celebration of the magnificent exhibition, Brush Writing in the Arts of Japan. I have to thank Dr. John Carpenter for this kind invitation to speak this afternoon, and also for giving brush writing the loving attention it really deserves. As you make way through the Japanese galleries, you will encounter a number of works that feature waka, the 31-syllable poetic form, commonly known as Japanese court poetry. In my presentation this afternoon, I would like to look at some of the dialogues that characterize the rich visual culture of waka, notably the dialogues between text and image and between the past and the present. Competition between poets of different eras is a good example of this dialogue between the past and the present. Pictured here is an imaginary contest, a poetry contest of 3 rounds between the 2 poets, Prince Tomohira and retired Emperor Gotoba, who are separated by 2 centuries. This is one section of a much longer hand scroll, or 2 hand scrolls, that showcases 50 pairings of such contests between 2 poets of different eras. The selection of poets and poems of this unique competition was curated by retired Emperor Gotoba, the 82nd Emperor of Japan, who is pictured here. Emperor Gotoba's reign is a celebrated moment in Waka's long history. The achievements of his court circle is remembered by the 8th Imperial anthology of Waka poetry, compiled under Emperor Gotoba's imperial order. The 8th anthology, titled New Collection of Ancient and Modern Times, makes explicit reference to the very first imperial anthology, Collection of Ancient and Modern Times, compiled 3 centuries earlier, around 905. There were 21 anthologies in all, numbering 30,000 poems. The first 3 are given distinction by the collective term 3 anthologies, and the first 8 are also given distinction by being called 8 anthologies. Imperial commissioned anthologies of Waka were the undisputed canons in Waka culture, and it is not an exaggeration to say that inclusion in an imperial anthology was the highest honor a poet could hope for, as it guaranteed that you would be remembered for as long as the Waka tradition was kept alive. This is in part because imperial collections were not only repositories of excellent poetry, but they also functioned as a database of poems and of poetic words and poetic associations that later poets would reference again and again. Knowledge of past poetry was a critical element of Waka education, especially because the standard practice of Waka composition was through assigned topics. In the presence of your peers at poetry gatherings, it was imperative that you were able to compose a poem that fit within the parameters, the expectations and conventions set by precedent and shaped through the past use. In this time-bending imaginary poetry contest, Emperor Go-Toba paired 50 poets active during the first 3 imperial anthologies, assigned to the left team, and against 50 poets from poets of the 4th to 8 imperial anthologies, assigned to the right team. From his perspective, then, this is a pairing of the poets of the past and the present. And the scroll follows the structure of actual poetry matches, where poets of the left presented first. The structure of the illustrated competition reflects the practice of actual poetry matches competed between the 2 teams of the left and the right. And this is a record of a poetry gathering from the 17th century, so a few centuries later. But this shows how the poets were seated at these gatherings. Placement is determined in accordance with the most important figure in the room, the emperor, see here, who sits at the head of the room. And it is from the emperor's perspective that the poets of the left sit to his left and the poets of the right sit to his right. This was a gathering held at the court, and we see here in attendance the elite members. As a member of the educated court elite, you are expected to have knowledge and command of Waka poetry. This diagram shows that, furthermore, at these formal poetry gatherings, especially at the court, there were specific rules of how one should enter the room. In what order should they enter, where to be seated, as well as the manners in which poems were to be recited, inscribed, and submitted. Some of the procedures were rank-specific as well, so in this way, poetry gatherings and contests were highly charged social events. Furthermore, the 2 sides of the left and right reflect the political structure of the Japanese imperial court, with the minister of the left ranked higher than the minister of the right. In a way, the structure of the left and the right, then, is not unlike the 2-party system in the United States, the Democratic left and the Republican right. Classical Japanese is written and read from right to left and from top to bottom, so this way and this way. So Prince Tomohira, the earlier poet of the left team, appears first. 3 sets of competitions are inscribed here, so left, right, left, right. In this 15th century copy of Emperor Go-Toba's pairing of poets of different eras, the calligrapher adds his own visual interest by changing up the inscription style of the 31 syllables. As Dr. Carpenter reminds us in the galleries upstairs, it's the art of chirashigaki, or scattered writing. So we have the 31 syllables split up in different ways, adding that visual interest. The idea of pairing poets from different eras was not Emperor Go-Toba's original concept, but one modeled after an earlier and much celebrated pairing of 36 poets known as the 36 poetic immortals, the poet greats of all time, curated by the 11th century scholar-poet Fujiwara Kinto. Legend has it that it was a debate between Prince Tomohira and Kinto regarding their assessment of poets Hitomaro and Tsurayuki that spurred Kinto to select 36 poets. And in the collection today, Hitomaro and Tsurayuki indeed appear as the first 2 of round 1. This is indeed a worthy pairing between the 10th century poet Tsurayuki, who was one of the compilers of the first imperial collection, and the 7th century poet Hitomaro, the undisputed sage of Waka poetry, whose achievements are lauded in the preface to the first imperial anthology written by Tsurayuki. In the exhibit, there are 2 fragments from the oldest surviving set of personal anthologies of the 36 poetic immortals. It is dated from about 1112. It is a set of 38 or 39 books produced to celebrate the 60th birthday of Emperor Shirakawa, who was the 76th emperor of Japan. These are fragments from Tsurayuki's anthology, of which there were 2 volumes. He was a good poet. He composed many poems. The way the fragments are mounted is very instructive because we get to see how the decorated paper presented itself to the calligrapher through this blank space. And that is how it would have looked before the calligraphy inscribed the letters. Calligraphy here competes and collaborates with lavish decorated paper. This is printed with mica that really delicately shimmers in the galleries as well. For this birthday project for the emperor, some 20 of the best courtier calligraphers were summoned to lend their hand. The beautiful lines of calligraphy is attributed to Fujiwara no Sadonobu, an heir to a celebrated lines of a courtier family renowned for calligraphy. His traces masterfully interact with the birds and the plants in the background in a kind of dance. I just love the way this is going, and also the way that kind of the calligraphy hooks around the elements in the back. For this deluxe birthday project, special papers were prepared using techniques that are even difficult to replicate today. Each book of the set is different, and one gets a sense of a competition between paper makers and calligraphers who were involved. Here are 2 more poetic immortals in the exhibition, Motosuke and Kiyotada. Motosuke is the 14th poet of the right team, and Kiyotada is the 13th poet of the left team. And Dr. Carpenter has placed these 2 poets facing off in the galleries upstairs. In their personal collections shown above, all of Motosuke and Kiyotada's known poems are inscribed in many lines. But in the portraiture of 36 poetic immortals, a notation of the poet's name and 1 verse typically accompanies the portraits. Both poets here wear formal court attire, as they would appear in court. Motosuke wears a soft cap, and he holds a scepter over his right shoulder, and Kiyotada is sitting upright. These are examples of 2 separate versions of these poetic portraits, but you can see in the way that the bodies are in fact quite stylized. This is because in the poet portrait tradition, the likenesses of the 36 poets were not produced during the lifetime. So this is also an imaginary portraiture. And we see that the attention is most closely given to the face. And many of these portraits of the 36 poets were produced over time across centuries. So although they are imaginary portraiture, they're truly one of the most familiar faces in arts of Japan. And oftentimes you see a codification of postures. As we see here, Motosuke is represented again in the 16th century example as well as a 15th century example. But you see that the painters have approached the coloring of the robes and so forth, but the posture remains the same. One of the highlights of the exhibition is the splendid set of screens, Flowering Cherry and Autumn Maple with poem slips. This is a densely packed, exuberant set of screens. It juxtaposes 2 icons of spring and autumn, placing the viewer at the foot of the trees that jut out from outside the confines of the borders, as if they're growing out of the viewer's space. The 2 sides are compositionally connected by a body of water that flows from spring to autumn. And let's see. When seasons are represented in Japanese screens, the conventional path is again from right to left, and the seasons unfold from spring to winter. And here is a good example of that. You see spring leading to autumn. But what's interesting here is that there is an added dimension of seasonal transition that meets towards the center. Cherry blossoms change from fully bloomed to many petals scattering. And here we see the leaves in full color, that it's slowly transitioning to withering and perhaps falling. This transition towards the center, or the meeting point of the screen, is countered by yet another movement, the suggestion of a great gust of wind that just swept through the scene, sending the poem slips aflutter. In both screens, the slips are leaning in this direction. It is a fascinating blend of naturalism and artifice, with the trees filling every inch of the pictorial field. And you'll see that every flower and every leaf is facing the viewer. But at the same time, we have this delicate rendering of petals falling. We also have a very delicate rendering of the ways that some leaves and some petals are in water. So this oscillation between stillness, pause, and movement powerfully captures the viewer's attention. And added to this screen also are striped curtains, which frames the scene as an outdoor banquet. The trunk of the cherry tree is surrounded by a curtain, whereas the curtain in the maple screen covers the trunk away from the viewer. This adds a further sense that as viewers, we are enclosed by these curtains, seated in a banquet suite that bridges the two seasons. There are 15 poem slips, or Tanzaku, featured in each of the screens. I have them highlighted here. They are each inscribed, bringing in textual content into the composition. In the digital reproductions here, you see that the flowers and leaves engulf the poem slips. But in the gallery upstairs, I think you'll see that the large and prominently rendered slips really come to the fore, and also because they're densely decorated, and also the color of ink really comes through. So I think that the screen is a poster child, a testimony that it's important to come to the museum and see the work for yourselves, because it's quite different in the way it's digitally rendered. The poem slips are rendered in trompe-l'oeil technique, carefully emulating techniques of actual poem slips from strips of cut gold foil and swirls of ink. In the two slips to your right, the poems are inscribed in their entirety. To your left, the poem slip bends in the wind, and some portion of the poem is maxed by the branch. The credit for illusionistic representation of the poem slips being a flutter goes to the painter, but it is also to the calligrapher's credit that the poems also appear to capture the sense that the whole poem is spelled out in each 30 poem sheets, just momentarily masked by the wind. This is extremely skilled calligraphy, most likely by a courtier who is yet to be identified. Here's an example of a partially masked poem slip, and it represents this poem. The gloom of autumn strikes sharpest into our hearts when we hear a stag calling as he presses through colored leaves deep in the hills. And in Japanese, that would be Okuyama ni momiji fumiwake nakushika no koe kiku toki zo aki wa kanashiki. So 31 syllables. And it is the words here and colored leaves, momiji, kiku and momiji, that are masked by the branch. So it's artfully masked, kind of edited out, challenging the viewer to test one's knowledge of poetry, in a sense. As that example shows, that was a poem from the Kokinshu, the first anthology. The poems that are selected for the screen and inscribed come from Imperial collections of Waka poetry, More specifically, they come from 3 collections: the 1st, 3rd, and 8th. Poems on the cherry screen are exclusively taken from the spring volumes of the 8th anthology, the Shinko Kinshu, whereas the maple screen takes 4 poems from the 1st anthology, the Kokinshu, and 11 poems from the 3rd anthology, the Shuishu. Kinto, the poet I cited for selecting the 36 poetic immortals, he played a big role in compiling the 3rd Imperial anthology. So once again, we have an instant of a juxtaposition between the past and the present. And it's not unlike the competition between poets of different eras we saw earlier. But here the order is reversed, the later anthology being represented first. In addition to the gust of wind I mentioned flowing from the left to the right, this counter movement from the old to the new is an interesting connection that I hope to explore a little bit further, but I don't have an answer for you today, unfortunately. And by chance, one of Emperor Go-Toba's poems appear in the scroll as well as the screen. So this particular poem here appears inscribed on this slip. It is a poem on the mountain fowl that was quite famous. The poem slips also add layers of information to the screen and changes the viewing experience right before our eyes. There are names of famous sites of Japanese court poetry referenced, adding the element of cultural geography. So you see here that these are the names of famous places noted for the cherry blossoms as well as the colored leaves. And in fact, places such as Tatsuta and Yoshino are quite famous locations today as well, where people go out to visit and enjoy the flowers and the changing leaves in spring and autumn. And if we were to name the 4 most famous sites for viewing cherry blossoms and colored leaves, it would be Yoshino and Tatsuta. And those are the very names that appear in the titles of 2 precedents that carry the names Yoshino and Tatsuta. A late 16th century set in Idemitsu Museum in Tokyo, and an early 17th century set from the Nezu Museum in Tokyo. The pairing of Yoshino and Tatsuta, of spring and autumn, is a binary that is emphasized in the preface to the first Imperial anthology. It reads, "To the emperor's eyes, colored leaves floating on the Tatsuta River of an autumn evening resembled brocade. To Hitamaro's mind, cherry trees blooming in the Yoshino Mountains on a spring morning seemed exactly like clouds." So this binary between spring and autumn, Yoshino and Tatsuta, as well as cherry blossoms and colored leaves, is emphasized in works like these, but also in many texts over the years. And in a way, this is also a competition between spring and autumn. And I should also add that the 4 seasons are very central to the art of Japanese court poetry, but among the 4 seasons, spring and autumn are more important than summer and winter. The sheer number of poems that were composed is quite different. With little indication of landscape, the screens are not intended as topographical representations of the physical sites of Yoshino or Tatsuta, which are both locations in Nara Prefecture, just 30 minutes away from Kyoto. This is a particular poetic mode of identifying and appreciating and celebrating a place, marking and making the locations, Yoshino and Tatsuta, into poetic sites through these poetic attributes, cherry blossoms and maple leaves. This associative function of seasonal motifs and the act of viewing and reading association is also the supporting mechanism of this writing box, featuring a portrait of the 13th century poet Ietaka, his poem on Tatsuta River, complemented by the colored leaves that appear on the inside of the box. And writing boxes frequently showcase poetic subject matter because it's the box to keep the instruments of writing calligraphy, but also because the writing boxes, especially the lid, was a central prop at poetry gatherings. That's where you would put the paper and so forth. These three screens share a core structure and composition, but the second and third examples, by introducing the poem slips into the landscape, stages a dialogue between the past and the present in very tangible and compelling fashion. It is a vision of poems from the past, Imperial anthologies, expertly inscribed in meticulously crafted poem slips that flutter about in this very compelling natural setting. The third screen, furthermore, introduces curtains to the composition, foregrounding the banqueting element. We as viewers are placed more firmly in the now at the scene of the banquet. And the poem slips are also inscribed with poems that map out a plethora of poetic associations. And I just want to share some of these with you. As mentioned in the preface, cherry blossoms or cherry trees bloom in the Yoshino Mountains on a spring morning seemed exactly like clouds. So we see the mention of clouds and multiple mentions of cherry blossoms inscribed on these slips. The scattered petals and snow that also appear in many of these poems are connected to cherry blossoms through the color white. It's a visual likeness that has made them into poetic associations. Also, there's mention of wind and mountain, elements that are represented in these screens. And interestingly, too, there are also mention of warbler and mountain fowl, which appear in the poems, but not quite in the image. But still, by reading, you're able to picture perhaps the singing of the bird. Same with these screens. You have multiple mentions of colored leaves, again, wind, mountain, and the idea of colored leaves looking like brocade appears again and again. Not represented pictorially, but mentioned in the poems is deer, which is a very important poetic motif. So you see that these dimensions are added through the inscription of poetry. And I just want to quickly add that conventionally, before these screens, the way to add poetry onto the folding screen format was through inscribing poetry onto a separate sheet of paper. This is called shikishi, these square sheets, which were then pasted onto the screen. And you have this example currently on view in the galleries above. So this set, by incorporating the poem slips into the landscape itself, as part of the pictured world hanging from the branches, it represents a significant departure from convention, and it illustrates the ways that the dialogue between the past and the present can take unexpected and fresh representation. It can be revitalized through the image, as we see here. The exhibition, Brush Writing and the Arts of Japan, beautifully showcases the rich and complex ways Japanese court poetry is represented through brush writing. It also illustrates the dialogues across genres and media, as often happens in the Arts of Japan. What a feast for the eyes for us viewers in the 21st century, and it calls us to bear witness to and participate in the ongoing dialogues between text and image, the past and the present. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Tomoko, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I loved when you showed us the one translation of the poem, and the very word that's obscured is the word momiji, the colored leaves, and so it's as though the painting is completing the poem. It's a wonderful idea. And as you put that up, I was reminded that originally when Peggy and Dick Danziger so kindly offered to let us have that set of screens in the exhibition, I made a promise that I would translate all of the poems on the screen as a condition of having it in the exhibition. I didn't realize there are 30 poems to do at the time, but if Peggy or Dick are in the audience, I promise you by the end of the exhibition, I will translate all of the poems. In my own presentation tonight, I'm going to talk about how calligraphy and decorated papers or painting can add another dimension to the literary experience. But to do that, I have to make the case of how and why it's possible in the East Asian tradition for calligraphy to be recognized as one of the supreme arts. And indeed it was for generations. Calligraphy was considered an art superior to that of painting, even to music. How is it that calligraphy is so revered? And one of the reasons I think must be the case is that from the earliest times in Japan, when Buddhism came into Japan, it brought the Chinese written language, and Japan also took the reverence for calligraphy that was so prevalent in Chinese elite culture. And when you look at illuminated sutras, when you look at the beautiful ways that Buddhist scriptures are presented, it's a reminder of the message that is found in the Lotus Sutra, the message that tells us that anyone who recites, copies, or has copied the Lotus Sutra will receive religious merit. And once you have a system of belief that copying of a sutra will bring religious merit or salvation for a loved one, then you have the underpinnings of a culture that indeed extols the written word. And so, for instance, in this beautiful fragment of a longer sutra scroll, you'll see that it's presented on gorgeous paper decorated with gold and silver. The Chinese characters are written in very legible form. They are written with authority. They have a nice harmony of forms. This is the kind of writing that's associated with sutras. But as you look at this fragment of a longer scroll, and imagine a scroll several meters long, done with such gorgeous paper, it's a reminder of how sutras were often presented in such gorgeous formats. And there was a belief in the idea that what is beautiful to the extreme is virtuous to the extreme. So once you have an aesthetic system, once you have a mindset that because something is beautiful beyond belief, then it's good beyond belief, then you have a system that's perhaps similar to the idea that we saw in medieval Europe, where creating a cathedral decorated with gorgeous religious artwork, that somehow is showing devotion to God. This is one form of presentation of sutras. Another way of the sutras being rendered, once again, a system of writing, the Chinese characters legibly written in a way to convey the message of Buddha. And here we have an illustration from the life of Buddha. This is telling an episode in the life of Siddhartha Buddha when his father, the king, is worried about his son meditating on his navel up in the mountains, and he's so worried that his son is not going to grow up in a way befitting a prince. And so he sends servants with oxen up to the mountains to carry all the garments and the food and the throne that he does. Of course, he renounces these to become a practitioner of meditation, and he will achieve enlightenment. So this is one way that sutras were decorated, with the illustrations in a register above. But I'm going to focus my comments today on secular calligraphy and Zen calligraphy done in a very different mode than the very highly ordered Chinese writing of sutras. I'm going to talk more about the potential for the brush to be used for writing the line in an expressive way. And I just show a picture from the mid-19th century that looks back fondly, nostalgically on ancient China, when calligraphers such as Wang Shizhi of the 4th century would have created texts of poetry, of scriptures, using this kind of elaborate setting. And in the galleries upstairs, we've recreated such a setting. And the kind of calligraphy that scholars, Zen practitioners would have created, you can immediately see, even if you can't read Chinese, everyone can see that this is a very different form of writing than what we saw in the regular script of the Buddhist sutras. Here we have cursive writing, cursive Chinese characters, and you can actually see the flow of the brush across the page. And you can replicate in your mind's eye the original movement, the gestures with which the calligrapher wrote. You can imagine the speed with which it was written, the pressure that was applied to the flexible animal hair brush. And this is what makes calligraphy an art in the East Asian tradition. It's an expressive form, and once you know the conventions, once you become familiar with calligraphy, you can appreciate the context in which this was made. And you start to see the difference between one Zen monk's calligraphy and another's. Now take a look at this. Forget what it means, that it's a poem on the theme of snow and it has a beautiful literary aspect. Just take it as a visual composition, a purely aesthetic composition. You see one flavor of calligraphy there. Then you move to another Zen monk's calligraphy. When somebody came in to look at this calligraphy from 10 feet away, the visitor from Japan said to me, there's Kokan Shiren's calligraphy. Very impressive. He was 10 feet away. He could read the style of this Zen monk's calligraphy, and you can see a completely different flavor. Look at how the strong horizontal accent is echoed again and again, and you can see that the brush was firmly pressed here, lifted slightly, then pressed again to create an energetic horizontal stroke. And you can see the movement of the brush, and you can see that the brush didn't waver. This is a very strong example of what is called a Bokseki. Bokseki is a term that literally means ink traces, and Zen monk's calligraphy was considered particularly powerful in its brusque, spontaneous style that expressed also the spiritual training. As I'll mention later, when Harada Rōshi is doing a Zen calligraphy demonstration, it only takes a few minutes to do a character or a line of characters, or even an entire poem here on the theme of sugar. But there's a lifetime of preparation, of mental cultivation, of spiritual cultivation that goes into creating this kind of calligraphy. And it was practiced to convey that feeling of enlightenment that a Zen practitioner was striving for. Now, when you look at this in the galleries upstairs, of course, it's very difficult to read, even for someone who has studied Chinese for his or her entire life. These characters are extremely cursive, but it's a famous saying. It's actually, even though it was inscribed by a Zen monk, it's a teaching from Pure Land Buddhism. And just for an utterly evil person, there is no other expedient means, there is no other way but to recite Amida, and achieve birth in paradise. There's just the Gokuraku is just rendered here in the most cursive of scripts. And you can feel the energy, the monk who has prepared this, no doubt at the behest of a wealthy man who was dying, because this person was worried that he had strayed in his life. He wasn't a particularly good person, and he wanted salvation. And so he was meditating on this famous line. And when we look at the calligraphy here, you can see something has happened. Look at how the characters seem to be, the brush is allowed to go dry. And that was intentional. It was a technique called flying white. Flying white, it projects the sense of intensity, of speed, of action, of vitality of these characters. And it was something that a Zen calligrapher would have practiced to achieve to great effect. And the borders of this scroll are actually decorated with a printed dragon and other Chinese motifs. And then this very simple phrase, I mention in some of the credit lines here that these are promised gifts from Sylvan Barnett and William Berto. They've given or promised several examples of these Bokseki, of calligraphy by Zen monks. Even though neither Sylvan nor Bill was able to read Chinese or Japanese, they brought together one of the finest collections outside of Japan, I should say, of calligraphy. And we had an exhibition about 10 years ago at the Metropolitan, and I'm very happy and proud that these important works have entered the Met's collection or will enter the Met's collection. I'm sad to report that Bill Berto passed away a little over a month ago, but Sylvan told me that this work by Zekai Chushin was among Bill's favorite. And I can understand why, I think, because it's a very simple, it's a ichigyo mono, it's just a one column of calligraphy. And look at how simple the characters are. It just says, the mountain is empty, a pine cone falls. Just a simple meaning, but up in the galleries, I've placed it next to a Soami ink painting of mountains, of solitary mountains. And this is very much a Zen experience of being in the mountains and experiencing a solitary feeling. And then you're all alone, and then a pine cone falls. And what does it do? It just reminds you even more of the intense feeling of solitude. And of course, you can see the flow of the characters and the hyper-cursive, the abbreviation of the characters, not worrying about legibility, but you still get the dynamic action, the movement of the original monk's hand can be reenacted. And similarly, we have this type of Zen style of painting and calligraphy. It became so prevalent in the medieval period and so closely associated with Zen monk calligraphers and painters that it has its own distinctive name. It was called Shigajiku. Shigajiku literally means Chinese poem, painting, hanging scroll. And this is a quintessential example, a splashed ink landscape with an inscription of a Chinese poem. And it becomes more important if you realize that this was by Josui Soen, who was the pupil of Toyo Sesshu, one of the great ink painters in the Japanese tradition, whose own ink landscape, splashed ink landscape, is now in Tokyo National Museum, a designated national treasure. And this is the pupil for whom Sesshu originally made that famous splashed ink landscape. So this very rare work, we are delighted, is now in a New York collection, just very recently rediscovered. And continuing the theme of Zen ink paintings accompanied by calligraphy, once again, we see the calligraphy done by a Zen master in a very brusque manner. In this case, he's actually quoting a Song Dynasty Taoist philosopher whose teachings were very similar to Zen. But here, I want to emphasize that when the painting is created in a Zen context, even the outlines of the figure, of the robes, have a calligraphic feel to them. And so both the brushwork of the inscription, the brushwork of the painting, partake of the same kind of calligraphic aesthetic. And perhaps the most illegible of all the inscriptions in the exhibition is one of my favorite, by the way, Konoe Nobutada's a Tenjin. And in this case, Konoe Nobutada, a very talented courtier calligrapher of the early 17th century, who was more than capable of doing the kind of graceful styles that Tomoko showed us, but he repudiated those orthodox styles to do a more orthodox form. And here, this is actually a Waka 31-syllable court poem, but look at how it has the forcefulness of Zen calligraphy. And even the depiction of Tenjin, the deified form of the courtier, the Heian courtier, Sugawara no Michizane, actually, this is a stylized character for Tenjin, his very name. So the figure is actually created from characters. Now, moving into the realm of Japan, I'll just briefly mention that in one corner case, there's a small scroll with but 4 columns of precious calligraphy taken from a hand scroll created in the early 11th century. This is the story of where Japanese court calligraphy styles really began. This is by Fujiwara no Yukinari, and it shows us a Heian courtier calligrapher, someone active in the early 11th century, just at the time of the Tale of Genji was being written, just during this flourishing of Japanese poetry and Japanese prose. We had Yukinari taking the models from the Chinese greats, such as Wang Shizhi, and turning it into something distinctively Japanese. And even when you blow up the characters large, even this is from the story of the autobiography of Bozui, where he calls himself the master of drunken singing. And he wrote a biography where he talks about aging gracefully with his 3 great loves, which is poetry, music, and wine. And then those of you who read the review in the New York Times, I was a little bit miffed after doing translations of 20 or 30 poems for the exhibition, and then I realized the reviewer had only included my translation of this very perfunctory mid-12th century email that just says, "Please come to the Prime Minister's party on the 28th. That's all it says. None of the beautiful poems that Tomoko introduced. And the reviewer is just trying to make the point that even in sending a very simple message, that beautiful calligraphy would be employed, a very stylized signature. But these characters, they're all Chinese characters, but written in a form suitable for sending a message, and it would have been sent to the person perhaps attached with a flower, and a page boy would have delivered it. Now it's been mounted beautifully and could be even used for display in a tea ceremony alcove." And Tomoko has already introduced this work. Even though some scholars say Fujiwara no Sadanobu, I've had some visiting experts come from Japan, experts on calligraphy, and they said, well, it's not signed Fujiwara no Sadanobu, but there's no one else that it could be by. And so this descendant of the great Fujiwara no Yukinari that I mentioned at the beginning of the 11th century, he was a direct descendant of Fujiwara no Yukinobu, and this is the Yukinari, a direct descendant of Yukinari, and then the poem is placed in this very elegant setting, as Tomoko mentioned, of decorated paper that demonstrates once again the reverence for calligraphy, and the poetry and the inscription of poetry is changed and enhanced, and the reading experience is changed and enhanced by having it inscribed on such beautiful papers. And another of my favorite works in the exhibition is this poetry match, an imaginary poetry match of fictional characters from the tale of Genji, and they're competing with each other. And these are poetry exchanges that didn't actually happen in the tale of Genji, but somebody put the poems together at a later date. And as Tomoko mentioned, the arrangement of the figures in this kind of scattered writing, shirashigaki, around the figures, adds an element of surprise and delight and changes the pace with which you read these poems. And I've been talking about calligraphy that's written on paper or silk, inscribed with a brush that records the motion of the calligrapher's hand. But what happens when you use calligraphy as a decorative motif on a gorgeous kimono? And they take the Chinese characters from a Chinese poem, and even though this is the most delicate embroidery, go up and take a close look at the embroidery upstairs of the robe here, and you'll realize that they actually replicated the actual stroke order when they created this. But to do the motif, they're creating it according to the conventions that would have been used if it was actually written with a brush. And another favorite work from the early 20th century, once again, you have to go up to the galleries and take a close look. And those of you who are experts on ancient Waka, like Tomoko, you'll have a little trick because they haven't shown you the whole poem. But once you know this is by Narihira, and once you can read a few of the lines, I was delighted when we brought this in just a short while ago, and I saw that they were playing a trick here in the early 20th century. They're going back and they're quoting 10th century court poems, And this is to see if you've memorized your poems. Some are very easy. This one's from the Tales of Issei. And others I was immediately able to recognize. By the time the exhibition is over, I have promised myself to figure out what all of the poems are. But once again, we have the poetry slip as a decorative motif. And to conclude my presentation today, I want to bring us right up to date with a calligrapher who indeed has bridged the centuries. Shinoda Toko has created a thoroughly modern transcription of an ancient Heian poem. This is the character for Hana, for instance, for those of you who read Japanese. So it's her own distinct style. But if you go up to the galleries and see the transcription of the poem, you'll realize that she had mastered Heian styles of writing. She must have known the Heian styles of writing to do this kind of calligraphy. And then she's calling to mind the ancient formats for presenting poems. And in the final image, please go up to the Japanese reading room and see the large work that we've just installed. I've translated the poems alongside. But even without the translations of the poems, please enjoy how Shinoda, who has just turned 100 years old this year, and she's still doing wonderful calligraphy and abstract paintings, she conjures up the poetry formats, the Tanzaku, the poetry slips that Tomoko so eloquently spoke about. In this thoroughly modern composition, it still evokes the idea of poetry composition and the poetry formats of ancient times. Well, I've only selected just a few examples of calligraphy from the exhibition upstairs. This presentation, I hope, whets your appetite to go up and look at all of the works in the exhibition, including lacquerware, the ceramics, the textiles, works in different media. And I hope that after you go through the exhibition, you'll perhaps agree with me or perhaps start to understand that why, indeed, calligraphy is one of the supreme arts in the Japanese tradition. Thank you very much. For our final presentation of the afternoon, it's a great pleasure to have a demonstration, an actual demonstration of Zen calligraphy by Shōdō Harada Rōshi, who is visited from Japan. He is the head abbot of Sogenji Zen Monastery in Okayama, Japan. He also has a Zen monastery, the Tahoma Zen Monastery in Washington State. And so Harada Rōshi is a practitioner of Zen, but he is also a practitioner of Zen calligraphy. And earlier today, he did a demonstration of some works for some students and some of our docents and volunteers earlier. And when I saw his presentation, his demonstration of calligraphy, I realized that this idea of the practice of Zen calligraphy as a way of conveying the meaning and the sensation of Zen through calligraphy remains strong even today. In my presentation, I talked about medieval calligraphers, Muso Soseki and Kokan Shiren, who are famous as Zen calligraphers. But this tradition continued through the Edo period. Monk calligraphers such as Hakuin created numerous works, once again reflecting an attitude that the calligraphy can reveal the spiritual personality. And so it is with great pleasure that I introduce Harada Rōshi to do a demonstration of some characters for us. Please. Just before the lectures began, I was very pleased to be able to have a discussion with Harada Rōshi about various characters that he would be writing. I asked him to bring one of the examples of a Zen calligraphy that he had kindly done earlier in a demonstration, the one that's shown, that's already hanging. And that just reads Ichigo Ichie, a Zen saying that just means it's an extraordinary moment, once in a lifetime experience, just one meeting, something that you often hear in Zen settings or in tea settings. And for the calligraphy here, we had an exchange by email of words that I might like to have inscribed by Harada Rōshi. And I sent some words that I had studied many years ago as a Zen practitioner, and then he picked some other words to do. Now, the characters are Mushin. Mushin, perhaps the two most important characters, the two most important concepts in Zen calligraphy and in Zen practice. The idea of Mushin, literally no mind. No mind is the original state. It's something that you can't learn, you can't make, the original state of mind. When you say to do something mushin, it's as he's doing with his calligraphy, you can't do it with too much deliberation, you can't do it with hesitation, without disturbance. So mushin is a famous phrase, and then just before we started, Chi-san, who has helped out, told me a wonderful quote from Obaku Danzai Zenji. And she quoted a famous phrase, which I enjoyed so much, and says, "Don't give your offerings to 10,000 Buddhas. Give your offerings to Mushin no Donin, a practitioner of the way, a monk who has achieved Mushin." And I like that idea very much. And those are the two characters that he's written first. The next will be Yume. let me just, the character, can everyone see, those of you who read Japanese or Chinese will realize that Harada Rōshi has created a very abstracted version of the stroke. But can you see what I spoke of before, this idea of the flying white? You can feel the motion, but he didn't write so quickly. Do you see, even to create that effect, he, for instance, this line here, there was no, it wasn't done at a super fast pace, but then he had complete control of the brush and a little bit of excitement, exuberance to create this little bit. He's made it in a vertical format. Thank you. Oh, I should say something about the meaning of the character of Yume. Yume, of course, literally means dream. We have the very same saying that you would find in Zen teachings, that life is like a dream. Our lives are like a dream within a dream. Zen teachings would be that you enjoy that dreams. But I was very interested to hear earlier the Zen teaching that people of Zen don't seek dreams, but ultimately dream is the nature of all human reality. The next character is one that I actually did request, and I think this is the fundamental, the character Mu. Now, in the character for Mu, if those of you who know a bit of Chinese or Japanese, it's the character for, it means nothing. It means, it's a character, when you write Mu normally, it's a character that consists of many horizontal and vertical straight lines. But please notice how the shape of the character has been transformed in Harada Rōshi's calligraphy. And do you see what has happened here to the character? The central form of the character for Nashi, or Mu, has taken on a circular form. And I noticed this when I received a copy of Harada Rōshi's calligraphy, that he often is turning very complex vertical and horizontal structures into this kind of curved line. So watch what happens to this kind of a line later. And let me just say something about this fundamental word, mu, or nothingness, wu in Chinese. This wisdom that I'm about to relate is not my own. It's from the discussions that we had just before the lectures began. The ideas of shapes and forms, when you take them individually, they're very easy to explain. But what happens when you take things as a totality, as is advocated by Zen teachings? There's no way to actually express the whole. And so a Zen practitioner, as Bodhidharma once said, just say mu, no form. So mu represents the fundamental teaching of Zen Buddhism. We saw mu in this form, and then it was Mu was also the very first character in Mushin on the far left. And for the final example of characters, we've asked to do a enso, a Zen circle. In the creation of enso, those of you who have observed Zen painting, Zen calligraphy, you will know that this is one of the more common forms. The enso, just the Zen circle, it's reflection that the mind has no form. In Zen teachings, when you have the idea of no ego, then you have no corners. The enso represents the original essence, the mind, and it reflects that light. In one instance of the mind, you see the Dharma body. So the enso is the final culmination, really, of what we see developing here in the character for Mu. Thank you very much for this. I would like to just make some final comments on the calligraphy that we've seen created here and up in the galleries. The Zen calligraphy styles, as practiced by Harada Rōshi, and the examples of Zen calligraphy in the galleries, we have something that's completely distinct from orthodox calligraphy of the sutras, of court calligraphy as practiced in China or Japan. And in the examples of calligraphy that were created by Zen masters, you have an instance of a Zen personality being transmitted that is distinctive in the way that the Zen monk is creating a style of calligraphy that would be immediately recognizable no matter where he has. It would be immediately recognizable wherever wherever you saw, let's say, at Enso or these. He is not trying to create a style of calligraphy that is immediately legible, but a form of calligraphy that is expressive of Zen enlightenment. The conclusion to the afternoon, I would just like to say, will be to join Harada Rōshi. If you have any questions or you would like to talk to him, he'll be right outside the auditorium in, I think, just a few minutes. And I would just like to take this opportunity now to thank Harada Rōshi for traveling here to do a demonstration for us now, and also previously for some students and volunteers. I'd like to thank Tomoko Sakomura again for a wonderful presentation, and I would like to thank Jennifer Mock and Nicole Leist for organizing this entire afternoon, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon for the presentation, and please go back and see the exhibition if you have a little bit of time. Thank you very much.